Okay, in this video, now that you've learned the process of finding an actual root by doing the factors of your constant term divided by the factors of your lead coefficient, listing out all your possibilities, and then using synthetic division to test each one until you find a zero, we're going to take that and we're going to move on to what we do now that we have found that zero. What does that mean and where do we go from here? So this is still the section on theorems about roots for polynomial equations. This is still a part of the process of solving a polynomial. So we're using this example. We're going to practice the skill we just learned, and then I'm going to explain to you where we move on from there. So factors of the constant term. So this is C, right? And C is here in my equation, and this is where A is. So every denominator with every we're going to do each numerator with every different denominator and then figure out where we go from there. So we're going to do plus or minus 1, and then factors of 2 are 1 and 2, so plus or minus. Now remember, we just discussed in the last video when we were finding these that a positive 1 divided by a positive 1 is going to be a positive 1, and a negative 1 divided by a negative 1 was going to be a positive 1, and that positive divided by a negative is a negative, and negative divided by a positive is a negative. So there's 4 technical possibilities, 2 of which will always be positive, 2 of which will always be negative. So essentially what you need to know is, instead of writing out every single numerator with every single denominator, which we certainly could do, we're going to save ourselves some time by knowing that out of those 4 possibilities, out of these 4 possibilities, we know that we're just going to end up with 2 results, positive 1, and negative 1, right? Positive 1 and negative 1. So I'm not even going to bother to write out all 4 of those possibilities. I just know for a fact that my 2 choices are going to end up being positive 1/2 and negative 1/2. So I have 4 possible roots, okay? 4 possible roots. So these are the 4 roots that we have to test until we find one that equals 0. So again, I'm going to scroll my page up. Not a lot of room to write on here. You can see in the parentheses, written in functional notation, I have 2 of them written down. That's a big hint, right? Big hint. So we're going to try the first one. So we're going to try positive 1, and then we're going to try positive 1/2, okay? Again, we use synthetic division to do that. So we're going to put 1 in the box, and then again, these are going to be our coefficients from our cube term, our squared term, our x to the first, and then our constant. So the coefficient for the x cubed term was 2, this one was -1, this one was 2, and this one is -1. So drop the 2. 2 times 1 is 2. 2 minus 1, or add these together, is 1. 1 times 1 is 1. This gives me a 2. 2 times 1 is 2. And 2 minus 1 is 1. Okay? Not 0. So, doesn't work. Let's try this one. Put 1/2 in the box. I know how you feel about fractions. If you have a fraction key, by all means, put it to good use. So we're going to drop this down. 2 times 1/2, or half of 2, is 1. Add these together, we get 0. 0 times 1/2 is 0. Drop down the 2. 1/2 times 2, or half of 2, is 1. Positive 1 and negative 1 is 0. So we found a root. Okay, the root is 1/2. Right? That's the root. The 1/2 is actually the root. That's what we plugged in to get a result of 0. So this is really saying to us, when x is 1/2, y is 0. And so on our xy plane, if this is 1, then we would have a root right there at 1/2. So y value is 0, so that is a root. That's what we just found, okay? This being your x, this being your y. So that means that this function somehow will pass through that specific point. That's a root. Our goal now is to figure out, how do I find all those other roots? I don't know what to do with them. So remember when you do synthetic division, and if you need to go back to the synthetic division section and review a little bit, that might be a good choice. But remember when we did synthetic division that this was always the opposite of what was in its binomial. So this was x minus 1/2, and remember that's how we put positive 1/2 in the box, because this is x minus the actual root, and the root is 1/2. So you write it as x minus 1/2. That is one of our factors, okay, the 1/2. We already know that it's a root, and the answer is 1/2. So when we set this one equal to 0, we're going to get 1/2. We already know that. So essentially, you don't really need to do anything with this. I'm just explaining it to you so you understand where it comes from. And remember that these coefficients ended up being the coefficients for the quadratic that was left. Because remember, if we started with an x third, then this became an x squared because we divided out an x over here to make the x cubed now an x squared. So I'm going to write x minus 1/2, and then this is going to be 2x squared. I don't have, so this would be the x squared, this would be the x, and this would be the constant. I don't have a middle term. It's 0. My middle term is gone, so I don't need it. And then I have my positive 2 for my constant, plus 2 equals 0. So what has this done for me? Finding this root has reduced this polynomial from a cube root now down to a square. We know how to solve quadratics. We can plop that into the quadratic formula. We can do whatever it is we need to do to solve that using quadratics. We could use the square root property. We could just factor the quadratic. So we're able now to solve for all the rest of the roots. So the idea with these polynomials is that we must reduce that cube root by some factor and turn it into a quadratic so that I'm able to solve it, because I know how to solve quadratics. So I found my root of 1/2, right, and that's here. So I would then do this. And this is the part I just said to you a few minutes ago you don't need to do, because given the fact that you got 0 up here means that 1/2 is in fact a root. So you can just kind of drop down here to x equals 1/2. I just need you to understand that that is actually a factor, right? We're factoring that polynomial. This is also a factor. But this factor, this second one, is now a quadratic factor, which I'm comfortable doing because we've just studied quadratics. So set it equal to 0. I don't need to use the quadratic formula for this one because I only have one variable. It's easy to isolate when I only have one variable. So 2x squared is equal to -2. Divide both sides by 2. X squared equals -1. And then remember we square root both sides to get rid of the square, and I get x equals, and the square root of -1 is I, so plus or minus I. So I have, in fact, found all three roots of this polynomial equation, and they are 1/2 and plus or minus I. We just solved a polynomial equation, okay? So it's a little bit of a process. You have to first figure out what that root is, then do some synthetic division to have a quadratic as a result so that you can then factor down the quadratic, okay? The next video will explain to you what to do with irrational roots and imaginary roots and how to write the polynomial function.